This is David Vottendall recording an audio essay for the final exam project of U.S. history up to the Reconstruction period. And what I want to talk about today is the changes the U.S. underwent during the market revolution, because that seems like a safe enough topic for a white person to talk about in early American history. What it starts out to start out with America leading up to the market revolution, which we can roughly estimate to have begun right about we may as well say it started after the War of 1812. That's a good enough starting place, because of course what we saw during the the War of 1812 itself did not have all too terribly much of an impact on the American economy, although certainly the euphoria of not getting annexed afterwards certainly helped consumer confidence. And during the 1820s, there was a large influx of, I say influx, there was a large influx of capital into new methods of production. Previously, industrial methods had been either the artisanal, manufacturing, so processing of materials, like, for example, turning raw cotton or wool into cloth and then into clothing, or turning raw metals into usable metal items. That's those sorts of manufacturing processes were almost exclusively the realm of artisanal labor, be it the traditional master and apprenticeship as we see in the larger cities, or out in the rural areas, the putting out system, where local farmers or other rural workers would perform a little bit of manufacturing labor every evening, and when they went into market to sell their produce, they would sell off. They would also drop off their what few goods they had produced. But this is a very inefficient system. It's a very redundant system, which has its uses, but that's not the point of the essay. The point of the essay is what exactly changed. Why is the putting out system no longer a thing? And the basic reason for this, sorry about the squeaking floor, it's a very old house I'm in, and so the cause for this change mostly relates to, there are many causes, but I'm going to start with one. There was a large influx of capital into new production methods after the War of 1812. Because the Second Bank of the United States was founded, or I suppose you could say refounded if we said it was the first Bank of the United States, but none of that really mattered. But that's just semantics right there. What's important is Alexander Hamilton's vision for America, which was an industrial nation, which was a chief exporter in the world and a player and an actor on the world stage. His vision began to outshine Jefferson's original vision, which was, of course, an agrarian America, which maintained a sort of distasteful distance from other nations, simply shipping them our excess agricultural products. That agricultural vision played into Jefferson's vision of a republic, and which was, of course, based off the Roman vision of a republic as idealized in the works of Cicero, Virgil, etc., etc. Unfortunately, that system does not make a lot of money, and small independent farmers may be content and happy with their lifestyle, but that does not mean they can buy. But they also cannot really buy much, as many farmers will attest to. And so Hamilton's vision became more appealing, especially to those who had large amounts of money and wanted to spend it, but didn't really feel like buying another mansion or renovating their own mansion again, or I don't know, buying more penny farthing bicycles or whatever people bought back then. So obviously, since there wasn't a lot to do back then, they just threw money into these crazy new production methods. Obviously, the first few were water-powered manufacturing systems. They were called factories, which was a little bit strange, but not entirely unfamiliar. Up until this point, there were actually, sorry about the cat, there were actually what might be considered factories. They were referred to as manufactories, and usually they involved gathering a large number of artisans of acceptable skill together in one large area, giving them a whole bunch of raw materials and telling them, all right, work for the rest of the day. And then when the sun goes down, you can go home. This is how the Romans and the Greeks produced an incredibly large number of pottery fragments. So many pottery fragments that we're still finding them today. And so, of course, these factories were based off of this notion. Well, however, the modern factories went far above whatever classical examples there may have been, because soon enough, water power was insufficient. We simply could not rely upon rivers to power our looms. There was not enough energy there. And so new methods of powering factories were searched for, and ultimately the steam engine was found. And, well, obviously the steam engine is very powerful and utilizes a substance which has no other use, being coal. There's not a lot to do with coal. You cannot really burn coal for home use, for any kind of domestic use. It requires a very high ignition. Coal has a very high ignition temperature, so you can't. So far more inefficient to use to heat a home. Charcoal is much better, but charcoal is not coal, as geologists will tell you. So coal was perfect for this. It burned long, and you could place a factory anywhere now. You could even place it in the middle of a city, much to the chagrin of the artisans, but then again, they don't really matter anymore. But on the other hand, they did not go down without a fight, although ultimately they did go down. And the death of artisans, and even though artisans never did entirely disappear, ultimately they did. Some artisans are still around. In fact, we still see a bit of a rebirth. In fact, we see a little bit of a rebirth of artisans in the modern age. Sort of like goodness, now I'm stumbling over words. Microbreweries, that sort of thing. More basically niche markets in which white people who have, sorry, I should not be racial here, anyone who has more money than they know what to do with, or at least they think they have more money than they know what to do with, can support an artisanal laboring system and purchase overpriced consumer goods for which are inefficiently produced, and then feel good about it. That's just it. Now, anyways, but this is all happening in the north. What's happening in the south? And now we come to the awkward part. All of this money flowing into the central bank of the United States. Well, yes, some of that comes from northern industries, but a fair amount of it also comes from the south, specifically from slave country, because, of course, in the south they rely on slave labor, which unfortunately the southern aristocracy had worked very, very hard to make as efficient as they could make it. So they had a fair amount of money, especially when the market was overall doing okay. And so with all this excess capital, they could invest, and they could invest in northern industries. Why not invest in these northern factories. Why not invest there? Because it seems like a sure bet, and you make a lot of money, and ultimately it keeps the northern industries up there and away from you. Because, of course, in the south, all the money, any money you want to invest in the south must be diverted into the purchase of more land and more slaves, and, of course, more agricultural utilities, but those make up but those are factored into the expense of slaves. Um, and so and so there was no incentive to invest in any substantial independent industry in the South. Certainly, you could place industry, in the state capitals. You may as well, and certainly a few railroads are necessary to load up bales of cotton, sure, or tobacco if you're something of a hipster plantation owner. But yeah, sure, a few railroads, maybe one in every other town, something like that. But you really do not need large railway systems. You do not need them to be connected or anything. They could be mostly privately owned. And there we come to telegraphs, kind of useful, maybe. We'll, they will not ask, they did not need, the South did not ask or receive much in the way of large-scale federal investment, mostly because they did not want to pay for it. Or if they did feel like they wanted it, they decided, oh, we will pay for it ourselves, not as a state government, but as private individuals, playing into that pseudo-chivalric method. I'm sorry, I just need to mention how ridiculous it is that the South set up this faux medieval. I mean, it's even more faux medieval than the Renaissance Festival, for crying out loud. And if you go there, it's just a bunch of weird leather fetishists gathered together in a field. Good food though, but still very weird people there. And then the South goes on and makes this weird pseudo-knightly concept with slaves. It's like they were trying to, we want to take something from Rome. We like the large, oh goodness, now I forget the name of them. The large landed estates of the patricians. Anyways, yes, the large landed estates of the patricians with large slave labor. Yes, we want that, but we also want the sort of we also want the sort of nobility and stature of the old world French knights. So how about if we just stick them together? Yeah, let's just keep mashing them together and see if that works. Anyways, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for diverging from the essay there, but that real gripe there that they act like they had the gall to assume they had any more noble blood than me. I mean, for crying out loud, I live in Minnesota. If I had any noble blood, I wouldn't live here. And then these Southerners somehow claim. Anyways, I digress. My digressions are sprouting digressions. But in any event, back to the market revolution, and in particular, the issue of government intervention. Because, of course, whilst many modern Americans pride themselves, or some Americans pride themselves on the idea that American government is unique in that we do not interfere with the market. Obviously, there's very little historical basis for that, just as there is very little historical basis that American government is always, well, there's very little historical basis to, well, oh, goodness, now I'm talking in circles right now. In any event, during the market revolution, the U.S. government, under the support of Whigs and kind of not under the support of the Democrats, Jacksonian Democrats, for those of you paying attention, the federal government invested substantial amounts into the surrounding infrastructure of the market revolution, not necessarily directly investing in the market itself, but certainly creating fertile soil. They were not tending to the plant of the, goodness, to use horrible metaphors. If the market is a plant, then the federal government put fertilizer around the plant. It did not cultivate the plant itself, but it put fertilizer around the plant. That's a horrible metaphor, but it works. And so this infrastructure, of course, were canals and roads early on, and then railroads later on. And much of this railroad investment went on in the north. A little bit in the south, well, that was mostly simply to transport bales of cotton to the coastline for export. And so not a lot of interconnectedness there, mostly just connecting up to local terminals and then straight to the coast. Whereas in the north, in the north it's difficult terrain, and so railroads go all over the place, connecting every town which had a factory in it needed to be connected back up to the main system. And so they wound up being interconnected, which was quite convenient come time for the Civil War, but we're not here to talk about that. And so, we've talked. What about what about the labor system? Well, we know about slavery, and that was awful, but it was also, quite frankly, very harmful for the market, because there's an entire strata of people, and yes, they were people, no matter how much they tried to deny it, they were people. They looked like us, and genetically they were the same. We may not have known it at the time, but yes, they are genetically the same. But in any event, we have an entire strata of people who have no purchasing power. And since they have no purchasing power, the only thing they contribute to the market is their RGO output. RGO being a weird term, I don't know what it means, but it basically means their raw resource output. They only can contribute their labor. They only can contribute their labor to the market. They cannot also contribute purchasing power to it, which is which really stagnates the economy. I don't know if there are any I don't know if there has ever been a statistical analysis of the overall purchasing of goods in the South, but it would be interesting to see if, just what the difference between purchases of consumer goods was between antebellum South and the North. Because you also had many of the so-called yeoman farmers, or rather poor, and then of course the poor white farmers. They had limited purchasing power as well. And that, again, is stagnating the consumer goods market, and therefore stagnating innovation in consumer goods, which can, of course, have bleed off into other areas, just as large-scale investment in military technologies can have bleed off into other areas. Basically just try and do an all-rounding investment. How about? In any event, I digress. That was the South. They were on the trip for sort of Orwellian stagnation. Don't know if that's an actual term, but yeah, but their society was on the path towards stagnating, because again, they were trying to engineer it too much. They were trying to control the lives of their children a bit too much. Not literally, but they were trying to control their society too closely. They did not allow it room to breathe, and so it would have been interesting to see where it would have gone, but I suspect it would have ended up being a bit of a bloodbath, either from internal rebellion or from external invasion. But what about the North? Certainly the North was doing better off. Well, the North needed all that excess investment from the South. The North needed all of that excess cash from the South in order to kickstart its industry. And later on, all that wealth from the South was still sort of flowing up north. And so, it was helpful. And of course, I'm passing over the issue of racism, because I feel there are people who can better describe that particular topic. There are people who are better qualified to describe that particular topic. And in the North, they relied on wage labor, increasingly on wage labor. And of course, nobody I think the factory managers liked it. Factory managers liked wage labor, but I'm not certain if anyone else liked it. It's it's a crummy system, but it's also efficient, very efficient, and it seems to be necessary in terms of industrial production because it's difficult to quantify just how many items a factory worker produces when there are thousands of factory workers in a single factory or within a or within a larger production system. It's difficult to quantify those things. Bureaucracy was still rather infant was at this time, and so we, well, the wage labor system is just what happened. Is just how the market determined it, and ultimately, of course, very little incentive for workers to produce other than to produce excess other than through punishment. So yeah, not better than slavery, not as good as as the modern wage system, because of course our modern system has had over a century and a half of our modern wage system has had about a century and a half, give or take, of refinement and social pressure placed upon it. So it had to improve. It could not stay the same. Suppose you could argue something similar to what antebellum slavery would have been, but I think we can agree slavery is something we try to avoid whenever possible. It's just one of those things that societies try and avoid. Let's see here. Talked about factories, talked about in the north, talked about southern economy, talked about northern wage system, talked about southern slavery. I think now that's left to talk about is the economy of the West, which is rather simple. The economy was it was a frontier economy, mostly subsistence, mostly resource exploration. Certainly, not a lot of investment going on from the government, mostly because nobody really knew what to invest in. Of course, it's unadvisable to just throw money in an unexplored territory, building random things and hoping the resource production and hoping there are resources there to support it. And so there could not be much investment there because no one knew what was there. No one knew what to invest in. And so yes, it was the West was trapped in a bit of an exploratory phase until more population could move in, which, as it turns out, did happen, thankfully, after the Civil War with the Homesteading Act. And all these wonderful Norwegian immigrants moved up to Minnesota and discovered it's really, really cold up here. And but thankfully they also discovered a rather low quality iron ore up in the northern portion. That taconite mining is well, it's sort of a low quality iron ore that requires eronium. But anyways, this is not discussion of the intricacies of iron ore mining. Obviously, the hallmark of the Western economy was the numerous gold rushes which occurred and which served to create such thriving metropoli as well, pretty much the Black Hills in South Dakota. I think they owe most of their white population to the after effects of the Black Hills gold rush. And I do not know much about the history of gold rushes, but I'm pretty sure you can find many communities which owe their existence solely to the fact that someone once found what looked like a gold nugget in the ground one day, and then suddenly the population spikes by by several hundreds of a percent. I know that sounds like a lot, but when the when the starting population is only about 125, it's a few thousand percentage increase is really not that much. But still, many communities in the West owe their existence to to a failed gold rush. And gold rush, silver rush, copper rush, take your pick. Any of the above really works. Gemstone rush, why not? Why not? And yeah, I think that pretty much rounds it out. Um, yeah, this is David Vartendal on my history essay, and I hope you enjoyed it. And yes, bye.